My name is Rachel, and I've always been the black sheep of the Morrison family. While my cousins spent their weekends at Grandpa's sprawling estate in Connecticut, learning about his business empire and competing for his attention, I was 3,000 miles away in Seattle, building my own life as a graphic designer. I preferred coffee shops to boardrooms, indie films to golf tournaments, and honest conversations to the carefully orchestrated family politics that seemed to define every Morrison gathering. The call came on a rainy Tuesday morning in October. Aunt Margaret's voice was strained, formal in that way she reserved for delivering bad news. "Rachel, your grandfather passed away peacefully in his sleep last night. The funeral is Friday. I expect you'll want to be here." I stared out my apartment window at the Seattle skyline, processing the weight of her words. Grandpa Morrison had been 87, sharp as a tack until the very end, still running board meetings from his study even after his official retirement. He'd built Morrison Industries from nothing, transforming a small manufacturing company into a multi-million-dollar enterprise that employed half of Millbrook, Connecticut. "Of course I'll be there," I managed, though my relationship with him had always been complicated. We'd exchange pleasantries during holidays, and he'd ask about my little art projects, with the kind of polite interest you show a stranger's vacation photos. I'd always assumed he saw me as the granddaughter who'd chosen creativity over commerce, independence over family tradition. The flight from Seattle to Hartford gave me 5 hours to think about the man I was flying home to bury. My memories of Grandpa were fragments, his massive hand showing me how to tie a proper knot when I was 7, the way he'd listen intently when I explained my college major, even though I could see the confusion in his eyes, his annual Christmas card with a crisp $100 bill and the same handwritten note, "For whatever makes you happy, Rachel." Margaret picked me up at the airport, her BMW spotless despite the October drizzle. She looked exactly as I remembered. Perfectly styled silver hair, expensive pearls, and that particular brand of controlled composure that had made her grandpa's right hand for the past 15 years. Since Grandma died, Margaret had essentially become the lady of the house, managing Grandpa's social calendar, overseeing the staff, and making sure his business affairs ran smoothly. "The whole family's already here," she said, as we navigated the familiar winding roads toward the estate. "Your cousins flew in from New York yesterday. Everyone's staying at the house, of course. I've put you in the blue guest room. I thought you'd prefer the quiet." I nodded, understanding the subtext. The blue guest room was on the 3rd floor, away from the family wing where Margaret and my cousins would be staying. Even in death, the family hierarchy remained unchanged. The Morrison estate looked exactly as I remembered. Imposing stone facade, manicured gardens, the kind of old money elegance that whispered rather than shouted. Cars filled the circular driveway. My cousin David's Mercedes, Sarah's Range Rover, Michael's Tesla. Everyone had done well for themselves, following in various aspects of Grandpa's footsteps. Inside, the house hummed with subdued activity. Caterers prepared for the influx of visitors. Florists arranged elaborate displays, and Margaret orchestrated everything with military precision. My cousins greeted me with the warmth reserved for distant relatives, hugs that lasted exactly 3 seconds, questions about my flight, comments about how long it had been since we'd seen each other. "Rachel!" David embraced me, his expensive cologne overwhelming. "God, it's been what, 2 years? Since Sarah's wedding?" "Something like that," I agreed, accepting a glass of wine from a passing server. David had always been the golden boy. Harvard MBA, successful investment firm, married to a senator's daughter. He'd spent every summer working at Morrison Industries, groomed from childhood, to eventually take over. Sarah joined us, elegant in her black Chanel suit. "It's such a shock, isn't it? He seemed so strong at Christmas." Margaret said he just went to sleep and didn't wake up. At least he didn't suffer. We talked about the funeral arrangements, shared memories of Grandpa's legendary 4th of July barbecues, discussed the logistics of managing such a large gathering. But underneath the polite conversation, I sensed an undercurrent of anticipation. Nobody mentioned it directly, but everyone was thinking about what would happen next. Morrison Industries needed leadership. The estate needed management. Grandpa's legacy needed protecting, and everyone assumed they knew exactly how it would all unfold. Margaret appeared at my elbow as if summoned by my thoughts. "Rachel, dear, I should mention, Mr. Patterson, your grandfather's attorney, will be reading the will on Monday. Just family, of course. I thought you should know so you can plan your flight accordingly." "Of course," I said, though something in her tone suggested this was more formality than invitation. "I'll stay through Monday." That evening, as I sat alone in the blue guest room looking out at the gardens where I'd played as a child, I realized I was already mourning more than just my grandfather's death. I was mourning the relationship we'd never quite figured out how to have, the conversations we'd never had, and the understanding that had always seemed just out of reach. Tomorrow we'd bury the patriarch of the Morrison family, and I'd return to Seattle knowing that whatever connection I'd had to this world died with him. Or so I thought. The funeral was everything you'd expect from a Morrison family production. Elegant, expensive, and perfectly orchestrated. The Presbyterian Church in downtown Millbrook overflowed with mourners, business associates, politicians, longtime employees, and half the town's population. Grandpa had been more than just a successful businessman. He'd been a pillar of the community for over 60 years. I sat in the third pew with my cousins while Margaret held court in the front row, accepting condolences with the grace of a seasoned politician's wife. She looked every inch the grieving daughter-in-law, though technically she was just my uncle's widow. Uncle James had died in a car accident 12 years ago, but Margaret had never remarried, instead devoting herself completely to caring for Grandpa and managing his affairs. "She's been incredible through all of this," Sarah whispered to me during a quiet moment. "I don't know what we would have done without her. She's basically run his entire life for the past few years." I watched Margaret as she spoke with the mayor, her hand resting possessively on his arm, her smile perfectly calibrated to convey both grief and gratitude. There was something almost proprietary in the way she moved through the crowd, as if she were already the lady of the manor rather than merely its caretaker. After the service, we caravanned to Grandpa's favorite restaurant for the reception. The Millbrook Inn had been his go-to spot for business dinners and family celebrations for as long as I could remember. The private dining room was filled with flower arrangements and photographs chronicling his life, his wedding to Grandma, the early days of Morrison Industries, family vacations, business achievements. I found myself studying a picture of Grandpa from the 1980s, standing in front of the company's first major factory expansion. He looked so vital, so confident, surrounded by employees and local officials. David appeared beside me, following my gaze. "That was taken right before I was born," he said. "Dad used to tell me stories about that expansion. Grandpa bet everything on it. Nearly lost the company when the recession hit in '91. But he pulled through. He always did." "I never knew that," I admitted. "I never really understood the business side of things." David smiled, not unkindly. "That's okay, Rach. Not everyone's cut out for it. But Grandpa always respected that you followed your own path. He used to say you had more artistic talent in your little finger than the rest of us combined." The comment surprised me. I'd always assumed Grandpa saw my career as frivolous, a phase I'd eventually outgrow. "He said that?" "All the time. He kept some of your college art projects in his study. That series you did of urban landscapes? He had them framed." Before I could process this revelation, Margaret's voice cut through the conversation. She'd climbed onto a small platform near the fireplace, tapping a wine glass to get everyone's attention. "If I could have everyone's attention, please," she began, her voice carrying easily across the room. "I wanted to take a moment to thank you all for being here today. Your grandfather, our family patriarch, would have been so moved by this outpouring of love and support." She paused, surveying the room with the confidence of someone who knew she commanded it completely. "Many of you have asked about the future of Morrison Industries, about what comes next for our family business. While today is about celebrating a life well lived, I want to assure you all that the company is in good hands. The transition will be smooth, and the Morrison legacy will continue." I glanced at David, who was nodding approvingly. Sarah looked relieved. Even my youngest cousin Michael, barely out of college, seemed satisfied with Margaret's words. Everyone appeared to understand something I didn't. "Your grandfather and I spent many hours discussing his wishes for the company and the family," Margaret continued. "He trusted me to ensure that his vision would be carried forward by those who truly understood his values and his dreams. Tomorrow, at the reading of the will, you'll see that his plans were both thoughtful and decisive." The crowd murmured appreciatively. Several business associates approached Margaret afterward, clearly eager to discuss the transition. I watched her field their questions with the ease of someone who'd been preparing for this moment for years. Later that evening, back at the house, I found myself in Grandpa's study. The room smelled of leather and old books, dominated by his massive mahogany desk and the wall of windows overlooking the gardens. This had been his sanctuary, the place where he'd made the decisions that shaped not just his business empire, but the entire town of Millbrook. I was surprised to find David's words were true. 3 of my college paintings hung on the far wall, professionally framed and positioned, where Grandpa would have seen them every day. They were from my urban landscape series, moody pieces that captured the loneliness and beauty of city life. I'd painted them during a particularly difficult period, pouring my feelings of isolation into sweeping brushstrokes and muted colors. Why had he kept them? Why had he never mentioned them to me? He was proud of those. I turned to find Margaret in the doorway, elegant even in her casual clothes. She moved into the room with the familiarity of someone who belonged there. I helped him choose the frames, she continued, joining me in front of the paintings. He said they reminded him that there were different ways to see the world, different kinds of intelligence. He regretted that he'd never learned to appreciate art the way you do. I had no idea, I said softly. Margaret smiled, but there was something calculating in her expression. Your grandfather was a private man about his emotions. He showed his love through actions rather than words. That's why tomorrow's reading will be so important. It's his final way of showing the family how much each of you meant to him. She moved to the desk, running her hand along its polished surface. I've been preparing for tomorrow for months, making sure all the paperwork is in order, that the transition will be seamless. It's what he would have wanted. Something in her tone made me uneasy, though I couldn't pinpoint why. The transition to the next generation of Morrison leadership, she said smoothly. Your grandfather was very clear about his wishes, very clear indeed. As she left me alone in the study, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important. Everyone seemed to know exactly what would happen tomorrow except me. But then again, I'd always been the outsider in this family. Why should Grandpa's final wishes be any different? I took one last look at my paintings on his wall, wondering what other secrets this house might hold. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of October weather that makes you want to stay in bed with coffee and a good book. Instead, I found myself sitting in the formal dining room of the Morrison estate, surrounded by family members who seemed far more awake and alert than I felt. Everyone had dressed for the occasion. Dark suits, somber expressions, the carefully controlled anticipation of people about to learn their fate. Mr. Patterson, Grandpa's longtime attorney, sat at the head of the massive oak table with several manila folders arranged in front of him. He was exactly what you'd expect from a man who'd spent 40 years managing the legal affairs of Connecticut's wealthy families. Silver-haired, impeccably dressed, with the kind of gravitas that made you sit up straighter when he spoke. Margaret had positioned herself directly to his right, wearing a black St. John knit suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She looked composed, almost serene, like someone who'd been preparing for this moment her entire life. My cousin sat across from me, equally well-dressed and expectant. Before we begin, Mr. Patterson said, adjusting his reading glasses, I want to express my condolences to all of you. Your grandfather was not just a client, but a dear friend. I had the privilege of witnessing his generosity, his wisdom, and his deep love for his family over many decades. He opened the first folder with deliberate ceremony. The last will and testament of Harrison James Morrison was executed 18 months ago and has been kept in our firm's vault since that time. I was present when he signed it, along with 2 witnesses as required by Connecticut law. 18 months ago. That seemed significant somehow, though I couldn't remember anything particular about that time period. Had Grandpa's health been failing? Had something happened in the business? Your grandfather was very specific about his wishes, Mr. Patterson continued. He spent considerable time ensuring that his bequests would reflect not just his love for his family, but his hopes for the future of Morrison Industries and his other holdings. Margaret shifted almost imperceptibly in her chair, and I caught the faintest smile playing at the corners of her mouth. David leaned forward slightly, his businessman's instincts fully engaged. Sarah had her hands folded in her lap, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. Now then, Mr. Patterson said, let's begin with the specific bequests. He started with the smaller items. Grandpa's watch collection went to David, his first edition books to Sarah, his vintage car collection to Michael. Each cousin received generous cash bequests, enough to pay off mortgages or fund children's college educations. I was surprised to receive Grandpa's art collection and a cash gift of $50,000. That's wonderful, Rachel. Margaret said warmly. He always said you were the only one in the family who truly understood art, but I noticed that Mr. Patterson hadn't mentioned the big items yet. The house, the company, the bulk of Grandpa's fortune. Those were what everyone was really waiting to hear about. Margaret must have been thinking the same thing because she couldn't contain herself any longer. She stood up suddenly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor, and smiled at everyone around the table. "I'm sorry to interrupt, Mr. Patterson, but I just can't help myself," she said, her voice bright with excitement. "I know everyone's been wondering about the future of Morrison Industries and the estate. Well, I can tell you that your grandfather and I discussed this extensively over the past few years. He wanted to ensure that everything would be in capable hands that understood his vision and his values." She paused dramatically, looking around the table at each of us. "And I'm so grateful that he trusted me with that responsibility. Now everything is mine to protect and preserve for future generations." The silence that followed was deafening. David's mouth fell open. Sarah blinked rapidly, as if trying to process what she'd just heard. Michael looked confused, glancing between Margaret and Mr. Patterson as if waiting for clarification. Mr. Patterson's expression, however, was anything but congratulatory. He was staring at Margaret with the kind of professional disapproval reserved for clients who've just made a serious tactical error. "Mrs. Morrison," he said carefully, "I'm afraid you've misunderstood something. I haven't finished reading the will." Margaret's smile faltered slightly, but she remained standing. "Oh, of course. I'm sorry. I just got excited. Please continue." Mr. Patterson cleared his throat and returned to the documents. "As I was saying, we now come to the disposition of Harrison Morrison's primary assets. First, the family home and surrounding property, valued at approximately $4.2 million. He paused, looking directly at me. "This property is bequeathed in its entirety to Rachel Elizabeth Morrison." I felt the room tilt slightly. Someone made a small sound. Maybe Sarah, maybe Margaret, I couldn't tell. All I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. The controlling interest in Morrison Industries, consisting of 68% of outstanding shares, valued at approximately $42 million, is also bequeathed to Rachel Elizabeth Morrison. Margaret sank back into her chair, her face suddenly pale. David was staring at me as if I'd grown a second head. Sarah's hands had moved to her throat, her perfectly applied lipstick suddenly standing out starkly against her shocked expression. But Mr. Patterson wasn't finished. The remainder of Mr. Morrison's investment portfolio, his bank accounts, and his other business interests, totaling approximately $18 million, are also bequeathed to Rachel Elizabeth Morrison, with the exception of a $5 million trust fund to be established for household staff pensions and severance packages. The numbers felt surreal, like something from a movie rather than my actual life. $70 million. The house I'd grown up visiting but never felt at home in. A company I knew nothing about managing. "There must be some mistake," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That can't be right. He promised me." We discussed this extensively. Mr. Patterson's expression remained professionally neutral. "There is no mistake, Mrs. Morrison. I reviewed these documents with your father-in-law personally on multiple occasions. He was very clear about his intentions." He reached for another folder. In fact, he anticipated there might be questions about his decisions, so he prepared a letter of explanation. "Would you like me to read it?" I found myself nodding, though I wasn't sure I was ready to hear whatever Grandpa had to say. My hands were shaking, and I pressed them flat against the table to steady myself. Mr. Patterson unfolded a single sheet of paper, and I recognized Grandpa's careful handwriting immediately. "To my family," he began reading. "I know my decisions will come as a surprise to some of you. Let me explain." Margaret was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Shock, betrayal, and something that might have been fear all mixed together. Whatever she'd been expecting from this morning, it clearly wasn't this. And honestly, neither had I. Mr. Patterson continued reading Grandpa's letter, his voice steady despite the tension crackling through the room like electricity before a storm. "For the past several years, I have watched my family closely, observing not just what you do, but who you are when you think no one is looking. I have seen ambition, and I have seen greed. I have seen genuine care, and I have seen manipulation. Most importantly, I have seen integrity, and I have seen its absence." Margaret's face had gone completely white. David was leaning forward, hanging on every word. Sarah had started crying quietly, mascara beginning to streak down her cheeks. "Margaret, you have been devoted to me since James's death, and for that I am grateful. However, your devotion has been conditional, based on your assumption that loyalty would be rewarded with ownership. You have spent years positioning yourself as my successor, making decisions about my business and my household without consulting me, and treating my other family members as obstacles to be managed rather than loved ones to be included." I watched Margaret's hands clench in her lap, her knuckles white against the dark fabric of her suit. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again, apparently thinking better of whatever she'd been about to say. "David, Sarah, Michael, you are all accomplished individuals who have built successful lives, and I am proud of each of you. However, your interest in Morrison Industries has always been about what it could provide for you, rather than what you could provide for it. You see the company as your birthright rather than your responsibility." David's jaw tightened. Sarah's quiet crying became more audible. Michael, barely 25, and still finding his way in the world, looked like he wanted to disappear entirely. "Rachel, my dear granddaughter, you alone have never asked me for anything. You built your own career, established your own life, and maintained your integrity, even when it would have been easier to compromise. You visit because you care about me, not because you want something from me. When you speak to me, I hear genuine affection rather than calculated interest." Mr. Patterson paused, looking up at me over his reading glasses. "Should I continue?" I nodded, though my throat felt too tight to speak. Around the table, my family members sat in various states of shock and disbelief. "More importantly, Rachel, you have something the others lack: the ability to see people as individuals rather than assets. I have watched you treat our household staff with respect and kindness. I have seen you listen to different perspectives without immediately calculating how to use that information to your advantage. These qualities, more than any business degree or family connection, are what Morrison Industries needs in its next leader." Margaret finally found her voice. "This is ridiculous," she said, standing abruptly. "Rachel doesn't know anything about running a company. She's never shown any interest in the business. How can she possibly—" "Mrs. Morrison," Mr. Patterson interrupted firmly. "Please allow me to finish." She sat back down, but her composure was completely shattered. The woman who had orchestrated Grandpa's funeral with military precision, who had managed his household and his social calendar for over a decade, looked utterly lost. "I am not naive about the challenges Rachel will face," Mr. Patterson continued reading. "Morrison Industries is a complex organization that requires experienced management. That is why I am also establishing a board of advisors, including several longtime employees and business associates who understand the company's operations and values. Rachel will have all the support she needs to grow into this role." He folded the letter and reached for another document. "Your grandfather also established a comprehensive transition plan. The company's current management team will remain in place, reporting to a board of directors that includes Rachel as majority shareholder and chairman. She'll have 6 months to decide whether she wants to take a more active role in operations or maintain oversight, while the existing team handles day-to-day management." "And if I don't want it?" I asked quietly. It was the first time I'd spoken since the reading began, and my voice sounded strange to my own ears. "You can sell your shares," Mr. Patterson replied. "However, your grandfather hoped you would at least give it a try. He believed you had more potential than even you realized." Margaret stood up again, this time more shakily. "I need some air," she said, and walked out of the room without another word. David cleared his throat. "Rachel, this is obviously a shock for all of us. But if you need help understanding the business side of things, I'm here. We all are." I looked at my cousin, really looked at him, and saw something I hadn't expected. Instead of resentment or anger, there was what looked like relief in his expression. "You're not upset?" I asked. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Honestly, I'm terrified of the responsibility Grandpa just saved me from. I've spent my whole life assuming I'd take over Morrison Industries someday, but the closer that someday got, the more I realized I didn't actually want it. The pressure, the weight of all those employees and their families depending on your decisions. I'm good at managing investments, Rachel, but running a manufacturing company, I'd probably destroy everything he built." Sarah wiped her eyes with a tissue. "I feel awful for being disappointed about the money," she admitted. "But David's right. None of us were really ready for this. At least, not the way you might be." "How can you say that? I don't know anything about manufacturing or business management or—" "But you know about people," Sarah interrupted. "And according to Grandpa, that's what really matters." Mr. Patterson gathered his papers. "Rachel, you don't need to make any decisions today. The transition plan gives you time to learn, to explore your options, to figure out what feels right for you. Your grandfather's final gift wasn't just the inheritance. It was the freedom to choose what to do with it." After everyone left, I found myself alone in the dining room where my life had just been completely transformed. Through the tall windows, I could see Margaret walking in the garden, her phone pressed to her ear, probably calling her lawyer or her accountant, or someone who might be able to explain how her carefully laid plans had just crumbled. I thought about Grandpa's letter, about his observation that I treated people as individuals rather than assets. Had he really been watching me that closely all these years? Had he seen something in me that I didn't even see in myself? My phone buzzed with a text from my best friend in Seattle. "How did the funeral go? When are you coming home?" I stared at the message, realizing I didn't know how to answer either question. The funeral had revealed that the man I'd barely known had been paying attention all along. As for coming home, where was home now? Was it my small apartment in Seattle with its view of the Space Needle? Or was it this grand estate in Connecticut with its weight of history and responsibility? For the first time in my adult life, I had the resources to choose anything I wanted. The question was, what did I actually want? Outside, Margaret had finished her phone call and was standing very still among Grandpa's prize-winning roses, staring at the house that was no longer hers to manage. I wondered what she was thinking, what she would do next. Whether she would fight the will or simply disappear from our lives as suddenly as she had entered them. But mostly, I wondered if Grandpa had been right about me, if I really did have the strength and wisdom to honor his faith in my potential. The only way to find out was to try. And for the first time since this whole surreal day began, that possibility didn't terrify me quite as much as it should have.